just reminded me to do so, so I'll put that on now. But for confidentiality purposes, if you want to rename yourself and maybe just put your initials on there, that's absolutely fine. I have seen some screenshots on social media where there's names and questions, and if you zoom in you can see those names, so by all means change your names. Confidentiality is quite key. So just a quick introduction. My name's Sarah. I am one of the directors of Strategic PA Recruitment. I'm a former EA, been an executive assistant for 20 years in the oil and gas industry and also the semiconductor industry. I am CIPD qualified and lived and breathed the EA role, and really understand the importance of the position in an organisation and for an executive, CEO, director, board level, etc. I wanted to create a company that really takes those values and really understands the impact a good EA can have on an organisation. I also founded 5 years ago BBO PA Network, which is a thriving community of executive and personal assistants. Networking is definitely a passion of mine. I'll just hand over to Marianne.
Sorry about that. That's strategic. Right. There's phone ringing in the background. So hello everybody and welcome from myself. I'm Marianne, and I actually come from a sales and marketing background, working for many years in the travel industry, particularly North America and Canada. So I specialised in cultivating and enriching client relations, and I carry that through today as well, along of course with networking. So Sarah and I together formed Strategic PA Recruitment last year, and here we are today. So moving on to the next slide. So before we start, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about Strategic PA Recruitment as a company. In a nutshell, we're a boutique recruitment agency providing executive assistance and personal assistant search services to businesses across Buckinghamshire, Berkshire and Oxfordshire. As I said, we launched late last year and we had a really exciting start to 2020, building relationships and our brand. And then of course, COVID hit and it really impacted the business landscape and almost put our brakes on a little bit. But we've been keeping really positive and we've been pushing through. And a post I saw on social media really sums up exactly where we stand as a company. And it said, just 3 words, come back stronger. So that's what we are planning to do. So why work with us? Well, one of our biggest things is about connecting people and building relationships. It's the heart of everything we do. As a company, we believe in creating long-term partnerships with everybody which we work with. And we're independent. We care a great deal about our business because we have the time to. We understand the executive assistant role inside and out. And we use our experience to ensure the passion of the assistant position shines through. We value professionalism, honesty, fairness, care and diversity, and these are actually our core company values, and they're always at the forefront of what we do. Our approach to business encapsulates these values, and as a partnership, Sarah and I really do wear our hearts on our sleeves, and we believe in providing the best service. Our 5-year partnership with the BBO PA Network, which is the thriving network for assistants, is key in what we do, and it's a great partnership. We also believe in matching candidates with the key stakeholders in terms of style and cultural fit, as well as key skills and experience, all of that being really, really important. Our business is not a numbers game. We are really unique. Each role we work with is approached on a project-by-project basis and given our utmost attention from the first contact to placement. We don't want to be a high street agency of hundreds of roles. We are boutique, we are niche, and we do wear our hearts on our sleeves. So what you see with us is what you get.
Absolutely. Which brings us to introducing our first online legal HR webinar. Chris, I'm going to hand over to you. It's quite an easy one. So Chris is a partner in the employment group at BP Collins and leads its immigration team. He has specific expertise advising clients who are involved in disputes and employment tribunal proceedings. He regularly assists on High Court injunctions and specialises in TUPE transfers. So on a day-to-day basis, Chris deals with a range of HR inquiries, including advising on the employment aspects that arise as a result of sales or acquisitions of businesses. And he is independently commended for his practical and commercial advice. So Chris, I'll hand over to you now, and you can tell everyone a bit about what you do. But thank you so much for joining us, and really appreciate your time here today.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Obviously, it would have been nice to have done this face to face, but it's nice to be able to do this. It shows how far we've come, that we're able to have these meetings and have them arranged so effortlessly almost. I say that with having not done any of the work Sarah and Marianne have worked to arrange today. I just have to turn up and speak. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me if there's technical faults. You can blame me. Hold on.
Moment we all hold up.
Okay, can you thumbs up if you can see the slides?
We're all good. Yay!
Excellent. Right. Okay. Okay. So, as I say, the conversation for the last few months has been all about coronavirus, and unfortunately, you get to hear me. It was quite interesting to hear Sarah sort of summarise my usual practice. The last 3 months has been nothing but coronavirus and everything that's sort of coronavirus related. So it will be nice at some point to get back to some sort of normality, but unfortunately we're not there yet, and who knows how long it will be before we are. And that brings me on to what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is the coronavirus job retention scheme. Looking at it as it is now and what it's going to become in the next few weeks, and then ending the session today looking at some of the practical issues that you might face and some of the decisions you're going to need to take over the next few months. Sarah and Marianne both mentioned there'll be time for questions. I'll talk to you for about half an hour to 40 minutes, but there will be time for questions, but I'm happy to if you put them into the chat area, that's probably easiest. Interrupting is probably tricky, but yeah, by all means, do keep your questions coming, and we'll have time for them at the end. Okay, make a start. So current version V1 of the CJRS, it's worth remembering this scheme has only been around since the 20th of March, and it feels like it's been around a lot longer than that. It feels like a very established scheme. For those of you who've had to grapple with the incredible pace of developments of it, it's been an unenviable task. And I think there's been, last count were 14 different versions of the guidance, 2 Treasury directions, and it's the first time in my career I've been advising on law that isn't law, but it's only been interesting. The scheme itself introduced the concept of furlough, which again, not many of us were familiar with before it came in. In effect, it's a greatly enhanced form of layoff, and it allows you, subject to agreement, employers can furlough employees and reclaim from the government 80% of the associated employment costs as a grant up to a cap of £2,500 per month. Now, you might remember back in March, it was intended to be in place to the end of May. It became apparent that was going to be insufficient, so it was extended to June and has now been extended to October. And that's clearly necessary. The latest figures from HMRC, you see on the slide, it's 9.1 million jobs have been furloughed, 1.1 million employers have been furloughing employees, and the cost is a sort of eye-watering £20.8 billion. You can see how important it's been to preserve jobs, and that's why at the moment the unemployment figures, or the people claimant figures, I think they were released a couple of days ago, so there's only 600,000 newly out of work employees. Unfortunately, it's probably going to get higher, but at the moment, this is doing a great job of keeping people in employment. The scheme itself has been subject to numerous updates, as I said, but there is only really one material condition that underpins it at the moment, and that's that an employee who's been furloughed cannot do any work So can't make any money or perform any services for the employer. And to do so would be an abuse of the scheme. This morning I'd said, my original note said that there'd been very little in the news about abuse. And then of course this morning, I don't know if any of you heard on the news, apparently it's up to a third of employees in a survey had said that they've been asked to do work whilst furloughed. That's obviously quite a worrying level. And if that's the case, then clearly widespread abuse is perhaps happening. I certainly know last month, Jim Harrow had said that he felt that this scheme is a magnet for abuse. So HMRC are probably at some point going to take quite a hard line in relation to how this scheme has been operated. We don't know how abuse is going to be assessed. We really don't know. There's so little detail about it. All we can say at the moment is that HMRC will look at this. We know how HMRC operate, and our advice from the start has been to make sure you just document everything you agree with furloughed employees, because the audit trail is going to be so important. The scheme relies on people self-reporting abuse, so self-reporting if they've not been, or if they've been asked to work. And if your documentation isn't consistent with what's actually happening in reality, that's going to create more problems, and HMRC are probably going to come and audit in more detail. However, considering the scheme itself, the absolute bar on being able to work, it dissuades employers from unfurloughing employees for obvious reasons. You become responsible for employment costs, and that creates a problem because the intended unlocking needs employers to start bringing their employees back to work. And if the choice is between bearing limited employment costs or taking full responsibility for them, that just isn't a realistic option at the moment. So that's why we have this concept of flexible furlough. So the announcement came in mid-May. We were promised a more flexible furlough scheme. Further details were provided on the 29th of May in one of the government daily updates. And then further guidance, a more detailed guidance, was released last Friday. There's a habit of these things being released on Friday. I don't know if you've had to be following, you'll know that it's always Friday they release the guidance, or just before a bank holiday, some point where you have no time to do anything about it. I had also hoped that I would be talking today about a Treasury direction that had been released at the same time as the guidance. That hasn't happened, and it is the Treasury direction that will be the guide for HMRC, and that is the document that has the detail that will be applied. So there's a slight caveat to what I'm about to say, but I think given what we know from previous versions of the directions, they will apply consistently with what the guidance has said. So don't worry too much about it, but there may be some slight changes once we get the Treasury direction. But what we do know, so from the 1st of July, employers can bring back to work employees that have previously been furloughed on a flexible basis. They can work for any amount of time on any shift pattern, and you can still claim under the CJRS for the hours not worked by those employees. And the guidance seems to give employers complete flexibility about the nature of those working arrangements, and that's necessary. I don't think anybody at this stage can say or put parameters on that flexibility, because no one knows the need flexibility. Employers need flexibility at the moment as they adapt to relaxation of lockdown and can reassess what their requirements. From a practical perspective, and when claiming under the new scheme, employers need to report and claim for a minimum period of a week, and those claims can't straddle calendar months. So there's been a bit of confusion about this. I know there's been a question that's been sent in about this particular issue. It isn't clear. HMRC is saying a minimum claim period is a week. That doesn't mean you can't furlough employees for longer, but you have to make sure that your claims are no less than 7 days, unless they are going to straddle months, in which case they have these things called orphan days, where you can make claims for up to 7 days. It's really confusing. I think the only way we're going to know how it's going to work will be once it comes in July. But really, you cannot claim for any more than a month in one go, because if it goes into the next calendar month, then the next month of the scheme will kick in, and I'll explain what I mean by that later. The requirement for agreement with employees is that you have to actually agree and confirm in writing the new flexible arrangements. Now, previously, you just had to notify an employee that they've been furloughed. It's now going to be the case you need to reach agreement with those employees. And again, I think that makes sense. You're going to need to agree new working arrangements with employees in the same way as you would in any other circumstances. Employees have got, they're if they've been furloughed for some period of time, it's going to take a bit of time to adapt. And employers don't really know yet how regularly they're going to need their employees to come to work and what sort of working arrangements they're going to need. So that obviously needs discussion and needs agreement before you implement it. As to reporting, you need to report the hours of work rather than just days. So if you agree a week on, week off system, the agreement needs to reflect that you're agreeing a week on, week off, but by stating the number of hours that will be worked, because again, the claim requires you to say what hours have been worked and what hours are usually worked. And there's some complicated calculations on the government website about how you do that. And that needs to be consistent with what's actually worked. So the document you agree with the employee needs to be consistent with the claim you make for audit purposes. And then finally, sort of fairly obviously, if an employee works, they need to be paid their normal salary. So that will be their non-furlough pay. If you agreed a salary reduction before furloughing an employee, then that would be the salary you pay them. If not, and any salary reduction is linked to furlough, then it's normal pay. And obviously tax and NI will be payable on those amounts as before. And the first date to make a claim under the new scheme is the 1st of July, as I've said. So it's a more flexible scheme, and the trade-off for that scheme is that the next set of claims, so from the 1st of July, a claim cannot exceed the maximum number an employer has claimed for under any previous claim under the version 1 of the scheme. That's actually more stringent than it sounds, because if you had, say, furloughed groups, so you've done 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, so you furloughed 50 of your employees at any given time, your maximum claim is 50 employees. Reality is you furloughed 100, but the maximum claim you can make under the new scheme will be 50. So that's quite a cut. That's not been particularly clear, and I wonder if that will change slightly, because in theory you have potentially 100 eligible employees, but only 50 you can claim for. So that does have the effect of limiting the amount you can claim for as of the 1st of July. And they'll administer that limitation by closing the scheme. So I'm sure you all know now that the scheme will close from the end of June. And if you hadn't furloughed employees for the first time by the 10th of June, so obviously that date has passed, you can no longer do so. So unfortunately, that opportunity has been lost. I say that there is one exception, and that was announced last Tuesday by the government, confirming that those on long-term statutory maternity, paternity, adoption leave who return to work during the next few months can be furloughed as long as your employer has previously furloughed someone. So you have to have made use of the scheme. You can't be the first person that's been furloughed. But aside from that exception, it's going to be closed in just under 2 weeks. And there's also a cost attached to this flexibility. I'll just take you on to the next slide. So first thing to say is, whilst the tapering will start to apply from August, June and July are unaffected, so the payments are as they have been since March. In August onwards, there's going to be a gradual tapering down of the contribution by the government. So in August, you'll see on the slide, still 80% contribution to wages, but employers will now be responsible for national insurance contributions and pension contributions. The government published some figures that they've quoted quite regularly, saying based on an average claim value of £1,380 per month, this amounts to around 5% of gross employment costs per employee. So they're saying a relatively low level, but even 5% to some employers at the moment, an increase in cost of 5% might be unmanageable. So again, we have to see how it goes in the first few weeks. In September, again, it tapers down 70% of wages up to a cap of £2,187.50. So again, employers at that point have to pay NICs and pension contributions and top up 10% to make up to the 80% cap. Now, if you're paying more, obviously you need to pay more, but you have to pay your employees at least the 80% that the government committed to. And again, the government have estimated that's around 14% of gross employment costs per employee. And then finally, in October, when the scheme comes to an end, it goes down to 60%. So the cap is 1,875 for the hours the employer doesn't work. So employers have to top up 20% to get up to the 80% cap at 2.5, plus employers' national insurance and pension contributions. So just looking at the figures, when the CJRS comes to an end in October, they're saying that's around 23% of gross employment costs per employee. So it's still quite a high percentage of costs being funded by the government. And if by September, October, you're still heavily reliant on it, difficult decisions are going to have to be taken as you come to the end of the scheme, because what you don't want to do is have the whole point of the scheme is to avoid a cliff edge. I don't want lots of redundancies, but the reality is that might have to happen, but what you don't want to be doing is leaving it too late. Okay, very briefly, I'm not sure how relevant this is, but I'll mention the self-employment income scheme, which has again been very popular. As I think there's been 2.6 million claims at a cost of 7.5 billion. So again, another very expensive scheme. I'll keep it brief. I'm not going to run through the detail of it, but effectively it allows individuals to claim 80% of their average monthly trading profits, and that's assessed on self-assessment tax returns or accounts, paid in a single instalment covering 3 months worth of profit, but capped at £7,500. Again, the second, and they were very keen to make it clear this would be a final grant, so there's not going to be any extension of this scheme either. Again, eligible individuals can claim a taxable grant worth 70%, so it decreases in the same way as a CJRS has. And again, that's capped at £6,570 in total. Eligibility criteria are the same for both grants. Individuals have to confirm that their business has been adversely affected by coronavirus. So that's a prerequisite, but again, I'm not sure, not particularly high hurdle. And finally, unlike the CJRS, you don't have to have claimed the first grant to be eligible for the second one. So there's no, if you haven't decided to or didn't need to claim for the first grant, that doesn't stop you applying for a second grant when it opens in in August. Okay, so that's a very broad and quick summary of the changes. Practical planning is what we're now going to look at. So you see I've posed some questions on the slides. I mean, there's probably many more. There's a lot to consider here. For example, I'm not generally going to touch on issues of people who are self-isolating and extremely vulnerable, that sort of thing today, but I'm going to look at some of the practicalities, things you'll have to consider as you gear up, and hopefully things start to improve over the next few months. So the first question I've been asked a lot is what happens in June and July? So what do you do between now and the scheme coming in on the 1st of July? Because lockdown is easing, businesses are reopening, and hopefully people will start to see an increase in work and will need to bring staff back. If it's permanently returning, that's straightforward. Depends on the terms you've agreed with your staff when they were placed on furlough, but subject to what that says, you can simply issue them with notice, say you want their furlough to come to an end and then require them to return to work. That might be a phone call. You may need to give notice in writing. Again, it depends what you agreed. And again, email should be fine as well. So that's quite straightforward. The difficulty arises if you think you might need them for just a few days to set things up and then won't need them again until flexible furlough kicks in on the 1st of July. So you can still bring staff back for a couple of days, as you've always been able to. However, if you then furlough again in June, you will have to furlough them for a 3-week period, it looks like. Now that creates a problem because the scheme then, or the claim, will straddle the 2 different schemes. It will straddle 2 months, which, as has been mentioned, the guidance says from the 1st of July, claim periods will no longer be able to overlap months. Employers who previously submitted claims with periods that overlapped calendar months will no longer be able to do this going forward. And that's necessary to reflect the changes I mentioned earlier. So simple option is to avoid it, avoid the issue by waiting until the 1st of July, but that might not be practical. And if that isn't an option, then what I've read is that you should be able to make 2 separate claims. The first one being up to the 30th of June, with a second one being for the balance on the 1st of July until furlough ends. The difficulty with that is we don't know how HMRC will respond, because that claim might not be for 3 weeks. In fact, it's very likely not to be for 3 weeks. And usually they would simply reject a claim that's for less than 3 weeks. Hopefully they'll just join the dots and see that it's the same employee. Their furloughs continue just under 2 different schemes, but we don't know yet. So we do have to wait and see. So if you can wait, you should, but that may, again, as I say, it might not be practical. So you may have to take a bit of a chance on that. I'm sure there'll be some clarity, because I've read that I think this issue has been raised already. So looking at the flexibility the scheme is going to provide, the question I've been asked to consider with my employer clients is, do they want to make use of it? And if so, how do they make use of that flexibility? So firstly, if there is insufficient work for employees to return, then the scheme operates as before. You just continue to make your claims, but you have to make them in calendar months rather than over a 3-week period, as you may have been doing. You don't need to do anything differently. The only addition I've made to that is if you'd said, we'll let you know what happens at the end of June, because that was the point at which it's going to, and you may need to just update your employees. But if you haven't got the work, you can continue to keep your employees furloughed. However, obviously the aim of the government, or the hope of the government, is that workloads will increase, employers will bring back larger numbers of employees, and that they will do that flexibly rather than cherry picking a few employees to return on normal hours and then leaving others sort of fully furloughed. Now, if that plan is to pan out, then when the scheme ends in October, everybody will be back to work, whether that be part-time or full-time, and that would hopefully then avoid the large-scale redundancies, which is obviously the purpose of this scheme. Now, there's a lot of benefits to this flexibility, to embracing this flexibility. You'll have the chance to benefit from a larger skill set, help those employees feel like they're part of the future, because there's been, if you've been furloughed, you'll feel more and more removed from the business. You've been potentially furloughed for 3 months. It's a long time to not have been in work. It also allows employees with other short-term challenges. So there's obviously a childcare issue at the moment with the schools the way they are, and that allow you to sort of manage their return without it being a sort of all or nothing choice as it is at the moment. But a lot of my clients are quite reluctant. They've have concerns about flexibility, and I think it's just a concern about flexible working generally. This sort of comes from two reasons for this. And the first one is there's clearly going to be administrative complexity attached to the new scheme. Now, as I said, I've spent a long time this week trying to get my head around these examples. It's far from straightforward, and payroll are going to have challenges. HR and payroll are going to have real challenges trying to figure out, what is required for the purposes of making a scheme. And some employers just won't want that hassle, so they'll stick to what they know and will keep employees furloughed until they're absolutely ready to have people back on the terms on which they're normally employed. As I keep saying, if you do have employees back flexibly, make sure the documents reflect the claim. So for audit purposes, there must be consistency between the two agreements you reach and the claim you make. Secondly, there's also, and I think a concern about introducing large-scale flexible working and the impact that will have on potential redundancy processes. There is a bit of concern that if you bring back all of your employees part-time, if you then need to make redundancies, there'll be quite a strong argument to say that all employees should be retained, but just on a part-time basis. And there's a reluctance on employers to potentially embrace that. I think that's slightly overplayed, and really employers are just focusing on hopefully building their workload back up to where they were before. That's absolutely the aim. But if the reality is that you already know you're going to be over-resourced come the end of October, then all I can say is that you should consider any flexible furlough arrangements alongside likely requirements from the end of October. It really is just trying to tally things up and tie things up and look at everything in the round. But certainly, from what I've heard, making use of flexible furlough is going to be best achieved by doing working in blocks. So 1 week on, 1 week off. It's certainly going to be easier to claim than agreeing reduced hours each day, because there is a complexity around the calculation. Now, it might be that once everybody knows how this works, it'll become more straightforward, but certainly at the moment, people are looking more at block days rather than reduction in hours across a number of days. But again, we'll see how this goes over the next few weeks. And the next point on my slide, I'm going to talk briefly about communication and consultation. This is a fairly obvious comment, and I apologise for making it, but employees really do need to be keeping in contact with their furloughed employees. All employees owe a duty of care, and from that perspective only, this pandemic has created huge amounts of anxiety across the board, but particularly for furloughed employees who feel concerned about their job security, and that's high on the list of factors that's contributing to this anxiety. It's always the case that insufficient communication from employers will add to concerns, and therefore maintaining that communication is really important. And I'd say that even if it's not to relay positive news, people will speculate if you don't say anything, and that's generally going to be worse than the reality. But even if it isn't, it's still better to know rather than speculate what the outcome might be. I mentioned earlier, so the scheme has been in place for 3 months now. So if you have employees who've been furloughed throughout that period, at some point you're going to need to sow the seed for the employees to either return partially or fully, and as if the business can support it, or if that can't happen, to ensure employees understand the business may need to take some hard decisions. And it's just setting the groundwork. Should the business need to make redundancies? Should you need to make redundancies? That's obviously not an easy message. It's easy for me to say, and I don't have to do it. I just have to advise on it. So I appreciate I can sit here and say that. But my experience is that it's much harder to make those decisions, or I've seen it's harder to implement them if there's been limited communication beforehand. It's a very easy criticism to throw back at employers. You've not been telling me, you've not been keeping me up to date. So now is the time to start relaying these messages, to start updating your employees on what's going on. If it is the case that redundancies are likely to be the only realistic outcome, then the first step in the process is to identify the potential number. And that dictates whether you need to collectively or individually consult. So just move on to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about collective consultation. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. This is a session on its own, and it's quite law heavy. I'm trying to avoid getting into too much detail. No one's interested in the case law that sits behind this. And to be honest, it's going to be tested in a way we've never really seen before, given what the challenges are at the moment. However, the test for collective consultation is on the top of the first bullet in the slide. Are you proposing to dismiss as redundant 20 or more employees at one establishment over a period of 90 days or less? So I've highlighted some of the words that have been litigated, and one of them is proposing. So what does that mean? It's less than a decision, more than mere contemplation. I'm sure that provides any real assistance. Essentially, you need to start consulting where you can actually make a difference. So it's something that's not already been decided. It must begin while the proposals are at a formative stage. So, and whether that needs to be collective or individual depends on so you need to have an idea of the numbers you're talking about here. So you do have to identify that there might be over 20 employees, because that's the trigger for collective. But even so, that the fact that you need to consult at a formative stage is true for individual or collective consultation. The decision can't have been taken, otherwise effectively it's a sham redundancy consultation. Case law suggested that you may propose redundancies even if there are still other alternatives being considered. And again, I think that's true more than ever at the moment. I think everybody might be thinking about redundancies, but they might not be ready to make them yet. That doesn't mean you can't. It causes a lot of disruption, putting employees at risk of redundancy. But what you don't want to do is leave it too late, because at that point you may have already made the decision, and that creates a difficulty in terms of defending potential claims if it turns out you need to make redundancies. There is also a question of what redundant means. The definition for collective consultation purposes is much wider. It means that if you're planning on asking employees to take a pay cut, and they were to reject that request, you might consider dismissal and re-engagement. That is classified as redundant for the purposes of collective consultation. Essentially, it's a reason for dismissal that doesn't relate to the individual employee concerned. So it's not conduct, it's not capability, but it's much wider than your standard definition of redundancy. So again, if you're thinking about offering pay cuts as an alternative to redundancy, bear in mind that if there is mass rejection of that, you then may be in a situation where you need to collectively consult, and getting the timing right on that is really important. And then finally, I'm just going to touch on the question of establishment. Again, this is a heavily litigated area. Some of you may have heard of the Woolworths case from about 12 years ago in the last recession, as to what amounts to an establishment for collective consultation purposes. And helpfully, again, definition is the local unit or entity to which workers are assigned to carry out their duties. So that's slightly narrower than it was thought it might be. And that in Woolworths' case, that meant branches. So each branch was a separate establishment. So they didn't need to consult with, I think it was something like 8, 9, 10,000 employees across the Woolworths business. And that did mean that stores with less than 20 employees lost out in their claim. I'm not going to say any more than that about establishment, because again, I could talk about it for a long time. It's not massively interesting. If you are thinking about redundancies over a number of sites, think about the question of establishment, take advice on it, because if you get that question wrong, then there may be a failure to collectively consult. So it's an important one to get right at the outset. Just on that though, it's worth pointing out group companies are separate employers for collective consultation purposes. So even if you're based at the same site, if there's 2 group companies, you can each propose 19 redundancies at the same site, and that wouldn't trigger collective consultation obligation. Okay, so If you decide collective consultation is required, you then need to decide who you consult with. If you recognise a trade union, you consult with the trade union. It's usually the case. That is subject to what the collective bargaining agreement says. So if you're only permitted to collectively bargain with a certain section of your workforce, then fine. You consult with them via the union, and you appoint reps for the rest of your workforce. But if the union is recognised across the business, then you consult with them. If you do need to elect representatives, then you need to carry out an election, and that's challenging at the moment. I think there's a few points to consider, and the first one is, how many representatives do you need? Generally, you want as limited a number as possible, because having too many reps makes it, effectively you're doing a large-scale consultation process with too many people, and it's too complicated. But I think you're going to need more reps at the moment because the circumstances are so unusual. It's difficult for employee reps to consult with a large group of employees realistically via Zoom calls. So you're probably going to have more representatives, but you've got to get the balance right. Ultimately, you as employers need to be able to meaningfully consult with those representatives. And if you have too many of them, there's an argument that can't happen either. You can't unreasonably exclude people from standing. So don't exclude furloughed employees from standing. They're permitted to be representatives under the scheme, so they can do that job. That won't be classified as work. The whole workforce should be offered the opportunity. And then when it comes to voting, that needs to be in secret. Again, a real challenge at the moment. I understand there are online providers who can facilitate secret ballots. No expert on it, but I'm sure someone will have devised a program that will allow that to happen. And then once you've got your representatives in place, the most important point is the clock starts ticking at that point. As soon as you provide the information to those representatives, that's when the time frame for collective consultation starts ticking. I'll come on to how long you need to consult for in a moment. You need to provide fairly obvious information to the representatives. So it's the reasons for the proposal, the numbers of employees that you're proposing to dismiss, total number of employees in the establishment in question, and the method you're proposing to select employees for redundancy and how you're going to implement them, and how much you're going to pay in terms of redundancy pay. So that's the minimum amount of information that needs to be supplied, and then the representatives go off and start consultation. The consultation process itself, so again, this may not be relevant, but if it's over 100, you need to consult 100 more employees to be dismissed within a 90-day period in one establishment. That's 45 days, at least 45 days before the first dismissal takes effect. Between 20 and 99, it's a 30-day process, so a minimum of 30 days before the first dismissal takes effect. Their minimum requirements, essentially the obligation is to begin consultation in good time, and I'm happy to say there's no cases where an employer has complied with that minimum time period who've been found not to have commenced it in good time. So as long as you, essentially, if you stick to the timeframes, generally it's going to be hard to challenge that there's been the consultation has commenced in good time. You're supposed to consult, and this is true for individual as well, with a view to reaching agreement. That's going to be tricky because agreement is not going to be forthcoming. No one wants to agree to their job being made redundant. Or exhaust the possibility of agreement. So that's the reality. What alternative options are there? Think about the alternative options available. And that brings me back to my point about part-time working. If flexible working has worked, then you can see a lot of employees saying, well, look, things will continue to pick up. Let's continue with this arrangement. We'll take a temporary salary reduction and look at things again in 6 months. And it really is for you as employers to determine whether that is what your business requires. How well is it working? But subject to you having gone through the consultation process, there's nothing to stop you issuing notice during the minimum consultation period, as long as the termination doesn't take effect before the end of that period. I would urge caution with that, because it does sort of open up a challenge to an employee saying, well, I was issued with notice on day 20. We hadn't really finished consulting. It just calls into question whether you've actually gone through a meaningful consultation process. But in theory, you can do that. And to be honest, in the current climate, if you need to rely on the scheme to fund part of these costs, and I'll come on to that in a minute, then you may well have no choice. But I would urge caution with that. And then finally, I've just mentioned, don't forget the HR1. That is a form you need to submit to the government telling them that you are proposing to DWP, proposing collective redundancies. And if you don't do that, it's a criminal offence and leaves you liable to quite a chunky fine. So it's an important one not to forget. Okay, so this next slide, this is the timescales for potential redundancy processes. Look at the number of employees as against, the length of consultation period and their notice periods. We did this because we were asked by a client to help them sadly shut down their entire business, just keeping the 2 directors on. So it wasn't a collective, I think of 17 employees, but they wanted to mitigate the cost as best they could. They needed to. It was really about helping them understand their cost implications of going through this process. So we looked to see whether firstly the scheme could alleviate the costs. And there has been some suggestion that the scheme should not be used to fund notice costs. It should be used, it's a job retention scheme at the end of the day. And I think it was last week, I think British Airways were a big target of some criticism by MPs who were saying that this is not what the scheme is for. Now that may be right, but there's nothing in the Treasury direction at the moment that prevents employers doing this. So in theory, you can give notice whilst the scheme is in effect, and the government are obliged to fund part of those notice costs. There's nothing to stop that happening. I think the reality is they couldn't say otherwise, because employers might need to make redundancies. All they would do is push the redundancies down the road, and that could cause real problems for business. They just don't have the money for large-scale redundancies that they're going to fully fund. However, statutory redundancy payments will certainly need to be funded by employers. But what they can do is, looks like you'll be able to fund. So taking, for an example, if you had 100 or more employees, you'd have to go through a collective consultation process. That consultation process must last as a minimum 45 days, a 3-month notice period. After that, you needed to start consultation last Monday. So that shows how quickly this scheme is going to end when you look at it in this way. Even for less than 20 employees who might be at risk of redundancy, so that's an individual consultation process, we'd say you could probably get that done in a couple of weeks. It may take longer, depends on the circumstances. But if you have employees with 12 weeks notice, then you've only got until the 23rd of July to start the process to make use of the scheme and to assist with the cost of those redundancies. So it feels like a long time to the end of October, but when you look at it in this way, it's not as long as you think. Okay. And then the final point I'm just going to look at today is holidays. This was the hot topic a few weeks ago. There was no guidance provided when furlough scheme was first announced. The government seemed to deliberately stay quiet on what's the implications for holiday. Could employees take holiday whilst they were furloughed? Were you entitled to require employees to take holiday whilst they were furloughed? There was no real answer to that question. Eventually they confirmed you can. It wouldn't break furlough. So that came out on the 13th of May. 2 things to note. First thing is you must top up to normal pay for holiday. So you can't pay at the furlough rate. And the second thing is that you can require employees to take holiday under the working time regulations. Now, some employers have done that. I know I've advised a number of employers who've done that, and certainly the ones, I've got a couple of clients who have are unionised, and they've fought quite strongly that they should only be required to take holiday to the maximum they've accrued during their furlough. So whatever they accrue, they take whilst they're furlough, but no more, no sort of holiday from the first few months of the year. But there are some employees who have not required their employees to take any holiday whilst furloughed, and that's potentially storing up quite a major backlog of holiday. So we've been thinking about whether it fits. Can you allocate holiday whilst an employee, or if an employee starts to be flexibly furloughed? And we think you probably can. And you could have a situation where if an employee comes back to work 2 weeks out of 4, perhaps switching with another employee, the 2nd and 4th week of their working pattern, they could be allocated as holiday. I'd urge caution, because we don't know whether that will be deemed to be reasonable. Now, the purpose of holiday is for rest and relaxation. That's what the working time regulations say. Can an employee genuinely be said to be having rest and relaxation on the week out of 2 they're not working? It depends, but I think this is a problem that employers need to tackle. The government have said employees can take holiday on furlough. They're effectively encouraging them to do that unless there is a reason why they can't. So they're thinking they're NHS employees, I think, people who've genuinely had to work flat out for the last few months. And the benefit of doing so is that the government, again, will pick up a significant chunk of the holiday pay cost. So it is something to consider. But I would just caution that whether that's reasonable, who knows, there might be a challenge to it. So I would look carefully at, I would only potentially consider this if you've got employees with quite a lot of accrued holiday. If you're going to be doing this to leave your employees with no holiday, then I suggest that's probably not a sensible idea. But if you are going to do it, you need to make sure you give sufficient notice. So for 1 week's holiday, you need to give 2 weeks notice. Okay, and that is the end of, that's all I was going to tackle today. Over to you for questions. Sorry, I think I've gone slightly over. I think we've left a bit of time.
No, it was pretty good actually, Chris. We do have a couple of questions in the chat,
Okay.
actually. First of all, we've got kind of a comment, and isn't it against the spirit of job retention scheme for employees to make previously furloughed staff redundant immediately or shortly after they're fully back on the employee's payroll? And could there potentially be a financial penalty for those employees who have taken advantage of a scheme only to make redundancies at the end of the game?
Yeah, that's a real concern. I mean, the short answer is that there's nothing in the guidance and the direction that suggests that's the case. But I'm just going to actually, I did see there is a quote as to what this scheme, the purpose of this scheme is quite. Let me just find exactly what the government were quite clear on why they implemented this scheme, and that does leave it open for them to run that argument. So the purpose of the scheme is to arise from health and social and economic emergency in the United Kingdom resulting from coronavirus and the coronavirus disease. So that does open up an argument that if your redundancies are not caused by this disease, so if you decide actually this is more a trimming exercise, does that make redundancy of employees who've previously been furloughed potentially challengeable? I think it might do. Just making employees redundant after making use of the scheme, the government have effectively admitted that whilst initially the hope was it's a job retention scheme, so the clues in the title that they didn't want employers to make people redundant, but the reality is it's gone on for longer. The V-shape recovery isn't going to happen, so they have now said people will be made redundant. So I think that situation is unlikely, but using it tactically could come with risk. Nothing to suggest that's going to be the case, but I did mention earlier HMRC are not known for their generosity, so if they are looking, if they're looking to recover some of these costs, then, I can't rule it out. Who knows? But I think it's unlikely. I think it would go against the spirit of, the implementation of this scheme, which ultimately, above all else, it is to save as many businesses as possible, even if it can't save every job.
Okay, we've also got one from Kay, and she says for you, Chris, if a person is made redundant shortly after furlough ends, do you anticipate an increase in employee tribunal claims, possibly related to furlough administration? What might be the types of claims? Yes, so
that is a possibility, particularly if you make redundancies now, because the argument would be, is it fair? So the concept, unfair dismissal, is the consideration is all about the reasonableness of the process and the fairness of the dismissal. Is it fair to make someone redundant, and did you follow a fair process in doing so? The availability of the scheme arguably says, well, you could have kept me furloughed. If you make me redundant now, what's to say in 3 months' time I may not have needed to have been made redundant? So you're moving too early. This decision has been taken too soon, and that does contradict slightly what I've said. If you know now that you're going to be over-resourced, then you need to start taking decisions relatively soon. So there is a bit of a conflict there. Each case will turn on its facts, I think. If it's obvious, I think the building of the business case is really important here. If it's really apparent from finances, from your financial forecasting, from your budgeting, that it doesn't matter how quickly things pick up, we are facing a massive shortfall and we have got too many employees, I think it's going to be a harsh employment tribunal that says you should have kept someone furloughed and you should have, and the fact you made them redundant is unfair, just on that basis alone. But, it is certainly an argument is something that we've been considering, and certainly if you chose to make someone redundant rather than placing them on the scheme, then that really is a challenge. And that comes back to the question of what the scheme is for. If that role has only been put at risk of redundancy because of the coronavirus pandemic, the suggestion there is that you probably should have furloughed me, and making me redundant now is unfair. However, what's the likely claim? Well, the claim is for unfair dismissal, but the damages would be capped, because if it's the case that you'd have still made that employee redundant in October, the losses are only going to be capped to that point. So it's a fairly limited claim. And one thing for sure, the employment tribunal system, if anybody's involved in that at the moment, it's in disarray. So the claim is only likely to be heard, I'd say you're looking at 1.5 years to 2 years before anything will happen on those claims, because they're absolutely overrun at the moment. So yes, there's an increased risk. And I think if you get it wrong and you misuse or decide not to use, and you could have reasonably done so, I think that could create unfair dismissal situations.
Thanks, Chris. I think there's another one, isn't there, Sarah?
Yeah, no, I've got on, if an employee resigns whilst they're furloughed and provides notice, do we continue to pay them furlough at 80% for the duration of their notice during their notice period?
Yes, it's a good question. If an employee gives notice, then yes, you can, because they're giving notice. It's slightly switched if an employer gives notice. So if employers give notice, it depends on the length of notice. If your contract requires you to provide statutory notice, there's a provision in the Employment Rights Act that says you have to pay normal pay for notice. So you might actually have to pay full salary for notice if you give notice. But employees giving notice, you can pay them at the furlough rate.
Okay,
that's great.
And so I've got a couple more questions really quickly. So Catherine asked, from 1st July 2020, with the minimum 7 days furlough pay claim, we only need an employee to work 2 days in a month. Am I right in saying we can't claim their furlough pay because they haven't worked 7 days in a month?
No, I think it's just the claim period. So you can have any kind of working arrangement you like, but you'd only be able to make that claim for the 2 days that the days they're not working. So say the 3 days if it's full time, within covering a 7 day period. I'm sure I've made myself very clear there. So you can, as long as you can't just claim for the 2 days on their own, you have to put in a claim for 7 days, showing the 2 days they've worked. So that's the period in which you're not claiming for, taken away from the maximum amount of time they would usually work. And then the difference is what you're looking to recover from the scheme.
Okay.
But that has to cover a 7 day period minimum. So it's a horribly, I must say, it's quite horribly complicated why they're doing it. And they're doing it on hours rather than days. So you have to work out what the normal hours are during a month, and it's worked out on calendar days rather than working days as well, which just sort of adds another layer of complication to it. As I said, I don't envy those people having to do it.
I don't envy you, to be honest, Chris. Oh my gosh, you must be just reading things constantly.
I read and reread that section of guidance and then decided this sounds like a payroll issue. I will bluff it by saying that.
Does anybody have any more questions? Sarah, did you have any more which should come through?
No, I'm good and conscious of time as well. So no, I think that's great from my point of view.
Good. Well then, I would just like to say thank you, Chris. So
No problem.
Your expertise is just invaluable. I think what you don't know is probably quite small. It was really really helpful and massively insightful. And also thank you to all of you guys for coming along today. We're a small business and we really appreciate your support. Moving forward, we'd be delighted to have, unfortunately it's not going to be face-to-face at the moment, but a virtual coffee with you all. And any introductions you could make for us would be massively appreciated. Moving on, we'd also really value your feedback on today and be really interested to hear what topics are current for your business right now. So please do drop us an email after. We will continue with our strategic series and be back in touch over the next few weeks with our next topic and date, which is quite exciting. And we'll just finish with thank you so much and have a fantastic rest of your day, week, and it's nearly Friday again. So thank you everybody for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll send a follow-up email.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.